It's been just over a decade since the United Nations adopted the Canadian-led doctrine known as the Responsibility to Protect, R2P. It's aimed at avoiding mass atrocities and genocides, and yet the world has since witnessed the terrible toll on civilians in Syria and Libya, to name just two. So, is R2P still alive or basically dead? Let's take a look at that. With a couple of familiar faces, here are Stein and Studin. Janice Stein, founding director of the Munk School for Global Affairs at U of T, Irvin Studin, president of the Institute for 21st Century Questions, editor-in-chief and publisher of Global Brief magazine. Welcome back to TVOU too.
Pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Let's just start with a handy-dandy definition. R2P is what?
Responsibility to protect, a resolution initiated by Canada, you're quite right, actually germinated by Lloyd Axworthy, then our foreign minister, ultimately approved by the General Assembly and used to authorize missions which, when large numbers of civilians are at risk of being killed, the international community gives itself the right, when appropriately authorized by the Security Council, to intervene with force.
So as the world looks around right now, it could be forgiven for thinking Libya, Syria.
Well, Libya, actually, interestingly enough, is probably the one case where R2P was invoked all the time to justify the action.
But the point is, given all of the atrocities that have happened in both those places, the question is, does it even exist anymore?
I think it's on, if it's not dead, Steve, it's on life support.
Okay, Irvin, your view?
It's definitely not on life support, because as long as there are genocides and as long as we can smell the stench of the Holocaust and the Second World War and the Cambodian genocide and the Rwandan genocide and the genocides in the Middle East and Africa today, it's very much alive. It's an evolution of historical thinking. It needs new wings, but it's very much alive today. Give
us an example of where R2P was invoked, it worked, people's lives were saved.
Well, let me just, in a roundabout way.
It's very roundabout because there isn't an
No, that's
example.
not true at all. That's not true at all. If you go to the thinking of Benjamin Ferencz, who is he's in his 90s right now. He was the prosecutor on the Nuremberg tribunal for the Einsatzgruppen massacres in the Second World War. He created the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is an evolution of general thinking about how we can stop genocides. So my point is this. R2P, as understood, I suspect, by Janice, never existed in any international sense, in any international understanding. That is, the sharp intervention militarily, often against the will of the Security Council, by the way, which is an important proviso, never existed in any understanding outside of a very narrow Western strand, particularly in Canada. I'll give you the example. If I say 1994, in Canada, obviously that evokes the Rwandan genocide, right? If I say 1994 in Russia or China, Rwanda doesn't make the top 10 list. Now, if I say R2P doctorates, how many doctorates and PhDs have been developed in Janice's and my university, at University of Toronto, at great Western universities? In the low thousands. We've developed a whole class of people who have made careers that, but think about it. How many doctorates have been done on R2P in this narrow understanding of the military intervention against state sovereignty in China, in Russia, and other major powers? Zero.
So Irvin just made my point. I really don't have to add very much. Russia, China, and other major powers don't know what R2P is, don't take it seriously. It's on life support, frankly, Steve. It is a Canadian innovation. It got support at a brief moment in history. And actually, I would be happy were it in much better health than it is, because it arose out of the global angst after Rwanda in 1994, where the world, frankly, stood by, even though it said never again. It was used to, you asked the question, there is one case where R2P actually was invoked again and again by the American ambassador to the UN when it went through the Security Council, which was the Libya intervention. It is probably the biggest...
I thought you were both going to say Kosovo. I thought Kosovo was a good...
Janice keeps
Kosovo
quoting American...
before R2P.
Oh, okay.
Kosovo, but let me just finish the point. R2P was invoked to authorize a limited operation in Libya. It is not regime change. It was, in fact, to stop Gaddafi's trucks that were going down the coastal highway and were on their way to massacre civilians. we did that, and there was a Canadian general in charge, but then we went on and bombed the regime and changed the regime. That is the single most complicating factor in the relationship between Russia and the West, a sense of betrayal that the Russians still feel that they were hoodwinked at the United Nations in the name of R2P. And since that time, unfortunately, it's been on life support.
Janice unfortunately quotes American ambassadors sometimes as representative of the global community.
No, but a representative of the United States in that debate. It's in the record.
Only the United States. The Russians didn't see it as an R2P intervention. If you ask Russian elites today, they hardly heard of it. And certainly no one's doing scholarly. No, but it means they view it in different terms, because obviously they approved it in the 2005 World Summit document. And if the Russians think that interventions to stop genocides are moot or irrelevant, then we must be forgetting our history, which is a bit of a problem. Because don't forget that the Holocaust in the Second World War started on Soviet territory, right? Ukrainians and Russians and Baltic Jews were the first to be massacred. So you cannot say that they're indifferent to genocide. It was on their territory. The Chinese, whom we say are indifferent to R2P, were the biggest sufferers in Asia. They call it the Asian Holocaust.
But when
Holocaust.
They stopped the genocide. Either of them.
Hold on. They stop it in different ways. That's the whole point. They approved it and said, wait a minute, but there's nothing that new in R2P as you understand it. It was only a eureka moment for us in our ahistorical understanding, because they said we have a long view of history, which is to say you don't just go and break up a state or intervene militarily to stop a genocide. There are many considerations at play, not least of which is Security Council approval.
Let me follow up on that, because those of us who live in the West who don't like the notion of governments attacking their own civilians and committing genocides against their own people may have a more favorable view of R2P than, say, Russia or China, which believe in the inviolable nature of borders, and you don't mess with somebody else's sovereignty.
Right.
In which case, do we have a 21st century stalemate on R2P?
Well, you know, we actually do, Steve, and it's not only a stalemate between the West on the one hand and Russia and China. It was an enormous struggle to persuade African heads of government that R2P was not simply a cloak to authorize Western intervention, and they were among the most strenuous resistors.
The African countries.
The African countries, and it's not surprising, frankly, because that's where the West has actually intervened. But let's take a longer view of history. Nobody intervened to stop the Cambodian genocide. Nobody intervened to stop the Rwandan genocide. Collectively, nobody intervened to stop the genocide against the Jews either in World War II. Collectively, we have a terrible record when it comes to any kind of intervention, political intervention, military intervention.
Wait a second, that just proves the point, Janice, if I may, that it's an evolution of an idea. If you think of R2P
but you can't say something's alive when nobody's ever used it.
Well, you cannot say something is alive if it's never been born. If it's never been born, it's never been born in the form you suggest. Or just say a eureka moment after the Rwandan genocide, fueled by excellent Canadian politicians, by Lloyd Axworthy, a friend, and Ignatieff, whom I commend on their idea that, yes, we should intervene to stop genocide. Who could disagree? Except countries that say, you know what, we've lived through genocide, we lived through wars, we lived through collapses of state systems, China, Russia. There are other things at play. That's why when Russia and China approved the 2005 document, to them it was a banality. It's 3 articles in a huge document. For us, it was a eureka moment. So we need to be more modest, but we should see it as an evolution.
How much water could we put in our R2P wine in order to get Russia and China to sort of sign on to something?
Let's take Syria. Syria has now killed, the conflict in Syria killed 250,000 Syrians, most of them by the regime, not by the Islamic State. 11 million out of 30 million displaced. I mean, we are seeing the wreckage of a country. There have been repeated attempts, Steve, to get a resolution through the Security Council. That shows, to me, that there is, after all this evolution that is talked about, there is no collective will that transcends national interest and concern about sovereignty to intervene even in a humanitarian way to stop genocide.
No, because what you need to understand is countries that have lived through genocides and massacres and bloodshed on their territory have a much more incrementalist view of international affairs. Hold on. Well, let's talk about people who are dying. And I'm a proud Canadian, but let's look at the basic ledger of interventions since the end of the Cold War. Who's got more blood on their hands from interventions? Us, because we have a non-modest view of military intervention, and in my view, and in the view of a good chunk of the world, unnuanced, which is to say there are many instruments at play. There's the diplomatic instrument, but the R2P of which Janice speaks is the sharp military instrument.
No.
Let's go in there and
What's
get
on
them.
your list?
No.
What
With our
Iraq?
money, what's that?
What would be on the list of our unfortunate interventions that have
We
therefore-
weren't part of Iraq, thank God. But of course there was Libya, and we've got the general bombardment of Syria, which is not a Western intervention. Libya was probably, as Janice rightly says, the straw that broke the camel's back. The Russians agreed, but the Russians agreed to what they thought was a banality, which is to say, we intervene, we do no-fly zones, but it's all got to be approved at the end by the Security Council. I repeat, the R2P of which Janice speaks as some eureka moment never existed in the minds of most of the deployment.
Let me just add, Steve, R2P is not only military intervention, right? R2P is diplomatic intervention, economic intervention. There's a strong emphasis on prevention as well as. But if you look at Syria, and that's why I think that is the funeral for R2P, frankly. Syria really is.
It's more than military
Diplomatic
intervention.
failure.
That would be a broader view of R2P
Well,
than the
that's
one
what-
we've imagined.
but that's failed too.
But no, it's failed on our side in the West, because after the Cold War, the United States, Britain notoriously, and we in Canada, look at our performance today, look at our assets, we ramped down dramatically. We've trained fewer linguists. We've been less curious about the world. We've closed embassies. And the center, we've been very dogmatic. Russia has been unstable, but look at China. Look at their look at their diplomatic assets around the world. China understands. I mean, they haven't been militaristic, notwithstanding the bark. Look at their assets around the world. They've got relationships everywhere. They've got people who speak the local languages.
including with Iran. They're back in
Yes.
business
They're
with Iran now,
everywhere,
aren't
and
they?
they speak the language. So the Chinese say, you want to do R2P properly? You have a broader suite of assets. Let's have relationships. And Syria is a place where diplomatic
I
relationships
can't let that one go by. I can't.
No, you must.
No, I cannot.
What's the problem with it?
China is among all the major powers in the world today the leading exponent of non-interference
Yes.
in the internal affairs of others and respect for state sovereignty, no matter what the government
What
is
is wrong
doing
with
to
that?
its.
What
Well,
is
I'll
wrong
tell
with
you
that?
what's wrong with that. When a government kills its own citizens, that's what R2P is about. When a government is massacring its own citizens in genocidal activity, the Chinese government will answer, it's all about state sovereignty.
You got to let me in this, because I can't let that go. Janice has a very narrow view of international stability. The Chinese say the reason we respect sovereignty broadly, and I'm not an apologist for
exception.
what. The reason we accept sovereignty broadly is that we don't want to see great powers go to war. Because if you want to see a genocide, watch the United States and China, or Russia and China, or Russia and the United States go to war. If we avoid that, then we're already in a better place, which, by the way, is the state of the world today.
In our remaining moments here, let's talk about whether or not, since this was a Canadian initiative to begin with, let's consider whether there is a role for Canada to help build a new global consensus on the nature of R2P and or state sovereignty.
I think this is the wrong time, Steve, to try to do that. One, because of the arguments that Irvin just made, which actually work against him, because the notion of genocide that he just articulated, as long as big powers don't kill each other, it's okay. When smaller people get killed in the middle of it all, that's not going to bother the Chinese. All that bothers the Chinese is if there's no major power war.
Well, you'll agree that is a good thing. We don't want major powers to go to war against each other.
But it's a very selective view of who gets to survive all this and who doesn't, frankly. It's not going to be very persuasive to the Africans or the Middle Easterners, let me tell you.
I think the Middle Easterners would be quite persuaded, given the state of the Middle East, that we shouldn't have been there.
The second reason probably we can't do this is a terrible moment in the history of the modern Middle East. It really is a collapse of the existing order. And therefore, to build this kind of global consensus where there's no structural foundation right now in the Middle East would probably be impossible to do.
So a waste of time for us.
And thirdly, I think, the West has exhausted itself. It's exhausted itself in a series of adventures. It's going to need time to regroup. And I think we need to do our best with respect to the basic conditions of humanitarian assistance. But to try for more than that right now, I think will fail.
Irvin,
Just a couple of things on that. Janice says that it's not necessarily such a good thing that great powers don't go together if smaller genocides are happening. But the basic understanding of a good chunk of the world in accepting R2P as this broader nuanced doctrine is that thou shalt do no harm, which is to say, if you go and try to stop a genocide, you can't stop all of them, but make sure you don't create more of a mess and more people die, which is what we did in Libya. And that was foreseen by sager powers. Now, on the Canadian role, we should be
But we had assets
fixing
in that
problem.
game.
We did.
Yeah,
Canada.
We boxed in the conflict.
Oh, that's a different debate. I don't think that's being juxtaposed. I think I took that one.
Finish up. Go ahead.
We're talking about the Canadian role. I don't think we're in the business of building consensus. We need to solve concrete problems. There are many places where Canada has assets or should build assets. We could be a problem solver and stop genocides. But there's a bigger suite of problems than genocides, and that's what we need to understand.
Gotcha. That's the latest, Stein and Studin on R2P.
Not an easy world.
No kidding. Ain't that the truth? Thanks so much to you both.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.